Throughout the 4 years of German rule during World War II, France was a nation divided, both by the occupiers and by the occupied themselves. Hitler had promised his adopted nation a reversal of the diktat, the humbling of Germany by the Allies at Versailles. His rhetoric was realized in a few short weeks of the summer of 1940, when the Wehrmacht routed the combined armies of France and Britain. It was now the turn of the French to be humiliated in the railway carriage at Compiègne. German antagonism towards France has a long history. When Germany launched its assault in 1914, her troops advanced rapidly on Paris. The Kaiser hoped to repeat the quick success of the Franco-Prussian War 40 years before. But the Germans were to enjoy no such startling victory this time, and all Europe was drawn into 4 years of a bloody, enervating struggle in the trenches. The most notorious battle of the war, for the French at least, was Verdun. Here, the Germans had promised to bleed France white. The town, of little strategic importance, became a rallying cry for the French. Victory was achieved under the command of Marshal Henri Pétain, and this sensitive middle-class officer became a hero of France, with a special place in French hearts. World War I ruined the French economy. As a result, post-war governments tended to look inward. The appeasers were in control, ready to do almost anything to avoid another European war. French military policy echoed the lack of confidence of the nation, the High Command wishing nothing more than to lick its wounds and avoid confrontation. France put its faith in the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Among other things, this determined that the German armed forces would never be large enough to threaten her again. As a further security measure, the French spent billions of francs on a massive defensive line designed to keep Germany at bay. But the next war would not be fought according to existing convention. In Germany in the late 20s and 30s, the army was developing the concept of blitzkrieg, and the Maginot Line would ultimately prove futile. Even though France and Britain honored their treaty obligations by declaring war on Germany after she invaded Poland in September 1939, the politics of appeasement still dominated the French cabinet. An essentially defensive policy meant that the French army could not muster the resolve to attack Germany's western border, and the government was content to sit out the phony war. She waited behind her fortifications, and the French people comforted themselves that ils ne passeront pas, the Germans would not pass. But pass they did. The Maginot Line proving no barrier to the German armored divisions storming through the Ardennes and sweeping across neutral Belgium. Guderian's panzers reached the English Channel just 10 days after the opening of the offensive in the west. The shell-shocked Allies, their planes destroyed on the ground, had been cut in half. The French army in particular was paralyzed by poor military command, and ordinary French soldiers could not comprehend the nature of the storm breaking over them. The roads were clogged with millions of refugees. France had taken to the road with whatever paltry possessions her fleeing people could carry. After the hastily organized evacuation of Dunkirk, the French armies around Paris did not expect to hold the Germans for long. Hitler appreciated the importance, as much symbolic as tactical, of the French capital. In history, the loss of Paris always means the loss of France, he intoned. It was only a matter of time before Hitler was to secure ultimate victory. In Alsace and Lorraine, which only a generation before had been German territory, the men of the Wehrmacht were welcomed as conquering heroes. Smiles and flowers greeted the invaders. In their turn, the Germans distributed aid to the refugees, negating propaganda that the invaders were nothing but latter-day Huns and Visigoths, intent on rapine and pillage. Now the divisions endemic within the Third Republic erupted, at a time when national unity was desperately called for. French opinion quickly polarized between the doves, those who wanted to sue for peace and an accommodation with Hitler, and the hawks, who wanted to fight on, using French North Africa as a base, having already accepted that metropolitan France was lost. The doves were led by Pétain. They felt that it was pointless continuing to fight when there was no hope of survival or of foreign aid. It was believed in France and in most other places on the globe that for all of Winston Churchill's fighting talk, it could only be a matter of days or weeks before Britain too succumbed. Already Goering's Luftwaffe was attacking British shipping in the Channel, and had begun its aerial assault upon England. Pétain hoped for a better deal if France came to the negotiating table with the majority of her territory and armed forces intact. He thought that it was possible to bargain with Hitler. The outgoing Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, who resigned on the 13th of June, had no such illusions. Reynaud, who would suspend the rest of the war in Buchenwald concentration camp, said to his cabinet, now based in Bordeaux, "You take Hitler for another Wilhelm I, the old gentleman who seized Alsace-Lorraine from us, and that was all there was to it. But Hitler is Genghis Khan." Marshal Pétain was chosen to succeed Reynaud because of his popularity. He had been the hero of France, both at Verdun and in quelling the revolt of the French army in 1917. Perhaps he could rescue France again. But Pétain had been scarred, like other Frenchmen, by the horrors of the Great War on the Western Front, and he did not want to see it repeated. Not understanding the nature of his new enemy, he was too eager to make an accommodation with the Germans. Most of France rallied round him when he approached Hitler for terms. In the new European order that was being imposed, he promised to safeguard the national interests of France. Hitler, forever the shrewd politician, knew just how much to give. For appearance sake, he had to let the French people convince themselves that their national pride had been salvaged even in defeat. Article 3 of the armistice acknowledged Pétain's government as the government of all metropolitan France, as well as of her overseas territories. France was allowed to keep her empire, her fleet, and the illusion of her national sovereignty. But the terms were a sham. Hitler wanted to punish France. No particular date was given for the release of the 2 million French soldiers in captivity. The Vichy army was to have no more than 100,000 men, and, in a further echo of Versailles, the French people were to pay not only reparations to Germany, but also had to finance the occupation. The humiliation of France was complete. She had been betrayed by leaders who did not have the stomach for a fight. In Paris, as the posters and German radio broadcast the terms of the disgrace, the people wept. Hitler chose the site of the signing of the armistice with care. It was officially a cessation of hostilities, but was in effect the formal surrender of France. The French delegates were not told of their destination, which was to be the very carriage on the very spot at which the German surrender had taken place in November 1918. The Führer had promised the German people that he would avenge the humiliation of Versailles. Hitler arrived with an entourage including Goering, Ribbentrop and Hess. He read the inscription at the Museum of Compiègne, which condemned the criminal pride of the German Empire. His face bore a look combining hatred, scorn, revenge, and triumph. He did not stay beyond listening to the preamble of the terms. Outside the carriage, he joked with his subordinates in a rare display of good humor. The German public shared his ecstasy, and Hitler enjoyed a Roman-style triumph on his return to Berlin. The streets were strewn with flowers and lined with adoring crowds. They were celebrating the man that in 7 years of struggle had transformed Germany. Little more than a pariah among nations in 1933, The Reich was now the master of Europe. Hitler, usually uninterested in visiting the countries which he had crushed, made an exception for Paris. The amateur architect visited the French capital in June 1940. The city seemed deserted. Its population had fallen from 3 million to 800,000 in the exodus that accompanied the German advance. The Führer visited the Eiffel Tower, paid homage at Napoleon's tomb in the Hôtel des Invalides, and commented on the ugliness of Sacré-Cœur. "It would have pained me greatly if I had had to destroy Paris," he later added. He marveled at having laid low the arrogant and decadent French, whose love of culture, he claimed, had so undermined her martial spirit. And as he contemplated his achievements, he must have felt that truly he was touched by destiny. Hitler had achieved such a complete and unexpectedly rapid victory over France that he could not immediately decide what to do with her. Paralyzed by his success, he missed the opportunity of bringing down Britain as well. For the moment, he was content to look at the white cliffs of Dover across the mere 20 miles of sea that separated them from Nazi Europe. Hitler never did develop any clearly defined long-term strategy for France. In the event, he treated it much as he did other occupied territories, looting the country to fuel the aims of his foreign policy elsewhere. The Nazis quickly set about dismembering the French state. Some land was set aside for the Italians, and a total exclusion zone round the Pas-de-Calais was established to protect the Reich from the area nearest England. Both of these zones were greatly extended after 1942. The rest of France was split between the Zone Occupée and the Zone Libre, the latter to be controlled directly by the regime established at Vichy. The French soon nicknamed the zones Zone O and Zone No-No. Hitler, always a pragmatist, was content to leave some part of France with a semblance of self-government. It suited his needs, as occupied territories were less of a drain on Reich finances if they could govern themselves. Pétain could rule in the south until the Führer determined otherwise. On the occasions that the two leaders met, Hitler could barely conceal his contempt for a man once great who had fallen so low. But any measure of self-determination that Pétain felt he had obtained was illusory. For the most part, his government of national unity was totally under Nazi domination. It was prostration, not accommodation. As one popular phrase had it, collaboration means, give me your wristwatch and I will tell you the time. The French spirit was so cowed by the German victory that in the early months of the occupation, Hitler was able to maintain his grip on the country with just 30,000 troops, a ratio of 1 German to every 1,000 Frenchmen. In Paris, the presence of the occupying power was quickly made evident when a vast swastika was placed atop the Eiffel Tower. The engineers doing the job had to climb the structure, the lifts being sabotaged in a spirit of futile resistance by the departing French. At the earliest opportunity, the German army staged a victory march down the Champs-Élysées and repeated the exercise every day until the liberation of Paris. The shop and street signs were now in German, and everywhere was the swastika and the field grey of the uniforms. Above all, there was the omnipresent need to carry correct identity papers at all times. Failure to do so could lead to a spell in prison or worse. Allied to these restrictions on liberty was the rigorously enforced curfew, which ran from midnight to 7 in the morning. Its sole practical purpose was to remind the population of their captive state. The all-night Paris of pre-war days was banished, to return only when the sounds of the jackboot had finally departed. In the immediate aftermath of the fall of France, the Germans tasted the sweetness of victory. The average soldier treated the French with some respect. In other countries they had despoiled, a trooper would have had no compunction in taking the personal possessions of a passer-by. But the French people they tended to treat with a caring, if somewhat patronizing attitude. Posters urged the population to put their trust in the German soldier. It was as though the French were abandoned children who had had the good fortune to be swept up by the big-hearted, nurturing Germans. To many troops, Paris became the ideal place to spend leave. The delights of the architecture, the food to those who could afford it, and the women who could always be afforded were obvious. Café society, as portrayed in German propaganda films, showed invader and occupied relaxing with each other in the ever-present sun. The French found it difficult to know how to react to the invader. Was ignoring them enough? Was giving them misinformation a sufficient act of defiance? Should you sell to them from your shops? Should you respond to any displays of affability on their part? When did you become a collaborator? Many chose to regard the German as invisible, as encouraged in Vercoeur's famous book, Le silence de la mer. In fact, the Germans were considered to be an alien presence by the average Frenchman throughout the occupation. The French initially referred to them as les Boches or les autres, after the oft-quoted maxim, l'enfer c'est les autres. Hell is other people. Later, when spirits seemed crushed by resignation, the Germans were simply referred to as ils, the French for they. The rationale for the existence of the Vichy regime was that Pétain and his despised deputy Pierre Laval, dubbed the horse trader as much for his appearance as for his dubious record in public office, would be able to maintain the dignity of France and work in tandem with the Germans. The realities of the situation began to bite as early as the end of 1940. It was a particularly savage winter, and it became almost impossible for citizens of average means to obtain fuel for heating and cooking. Not that there was always something to cook. In spite of images in the newsreels showing well-stocked shelves, food rationing became stricter as the war progressed, and the queues for the diminishing supplies longer. By 1943, citizens were expected to survive on a daily allowance of 180 grams of bread, 90 grams of meat per week, and 390 grams of sugar per month. One commentator in Nice wrote in June 1941, "People feel they're going to starve. Nothing is on the market, absolutely nothing. Every day we go back, we queue in front of the empty stalls from 7 in the morning until midday, in the hope that a basket of beetroot for cattle might turn up at last, and we might be able to buy a bit." These were starvation rations, and everyone, in spite of their individual consciences, found that they were driven to deal with the black marketeers. In the meantime, the civilians noted how well the occupying forces would eat, since they were able to requisition whatever supplies they chose from town or country. The streets of Paris now rang once again to the sound of horses' hooves. It was virtually impossible to secure petrol supplies, especially since the Germans did not even have enough for their own needs. Before the war, the city had about 350,000 parking spaces. By the winter of 1940, the Prefecture of Police had issued only 7,000 car permits. Parisians took to their bikes. There were some 2 million in the city by the time of the liberation, of which 3/4 were newly acquired. There are many fictions still current about the French resistance. The most pervasive is that all France united to throw off the tyranny of the oppressor. This idea was nurtured by General Charles de Gaulle for his own political motives. De Gaulle worked from the beginning for recognition of his own and French status, and for the day when France would again be liberated. This charismatic professional soldier had established a government in exile in London in the summer of 1940 without any mandate from the people. He did everything possible to foster action against the occupiers and told the French that there was an alternative to the collaboration of Vichy. The first of his famous broadcasts to the French people was on the 18th of June, 1940. The majority of Frenchmen were not even aware of the call to resist. Their horizons were limited by the daily troubles of existence, keeping their heads down and finding enough to eat. Initially, the resistance expressed itself in words alone, but these were real enough weapons. A defeated people living in despair and made ignorant through censorship needed words of encouragement as well as action. The heroism of the printers who risked their lives to produce the resistance pamphlets is often an unsung tale. From its humble beginnings, the Germans were to find French resistance ever more irksome, although direct action was a long time in coming. The first public assassination of a German soldier was not to take place until August 1941. Opposition to the Nazis took strength from several developments. The ever-growing disquiet of the thousands of deaths inflicted under Pétain's honorless code, the increasing German repression not just of Jews, but of any individual who happened to be singled out by the Reich. Hostages could be taken without any recourse to the courts, and any act of sabotage might mean their being shot out of hand. People could be executed for the most minor infringement of the occupation law. The German invasion of Russia also brought the hitherto compromised communists into the resistance fold. Before Hitler turned against the East, the Soviet Union had been on friendly terms with Germany, the two having dismembered the corpse of Poland in September 1939. Now the communists were able to lend their considerable resources to the resistance movement. Charles Péguy, a popular poet of the time, wrote, "In wartime, he who refuses to surrender is my friend, whoever he may be, wherever he may be, wherever he may come from, and whatever party he may belong to." The men and women of the French resistance were not of any one particular type. They came from every town and village, from every level of society. They were united in one thing, however. They dreamt of a new France that would emerge revitalized from the occupation. A France with a new sense of community and nationhood. A France that had once more found herself after so long in the wilderness. These high-flown sentiments needed direct and practical application, however, and this was a long time in coming. Although most resistance work involved gathering and passing on information, this still required considerable skill. It is difficult to train either a civilian or a soldier in the ways of covert operations. One leading resistance fighter said, "The average Frenchman does not possess a conspiratorial nature and only acquires the needed reflexes after much trouble if he survives that long." Sadly, many did not have the time to learn. Increasing resistance brought ever harsher repression. Hostage-taking and summary execution were the rule for acts of sabotage. In every major city could be found a German security headquarters, simply called the Gestapo by the French. The Nacht und Nebel, or Night and Fog decree, was issued at Hitler's order on the 17th of December 1941. It directed that in the occupied territories, persons who were charged with punishable offenses against the German Reich were to be brought to Germany unless they had already received death sentences from military courts. The so-called NN prisoners were tried by special courts. Upon acquittal, or after serving time for their offenses, they were not released. They would invariably be sent into the camp system, where they were denied any contact with their families. The favored concentration camps were Natzweiler and Gross-Rosen. Some 7,000 people were transported under the terms of the decree. Nacht und Nebel replaced the unsuccessful Nazi policy of taking hostages to undermine underground activities. Suspected underground agents and others would now vanish without a trace into the night and fog. If they were subsequently to die in the Reich, they were to be buried there. The location of the grave was not to be revealed. The victims were mostly from France, Belgium and Holland. By the time liberation came about, in France alone some 30,000 had been shot, 60,000 had been deported, and 20,000 had simply disappeared. In October 1942, Any claims that Pétain might still have had to legitimacy were over when the Germans unilaterally extended the occupied zone into the Vichy jurisdiction. They feared the overwhelming Allied forces in North Africa would soon be invading southern France. The single biggest factor in the growth of opposition to the Vichy regime was the introduction of forced labor, Service Travail Obligatoire, or STO, in February 1943. By this time, the Germans were suffering badly from manpower shortages on the home front, caused by the insatiable demands of the army. Vichy complied with German demands and drafted 3 categories of young French men, aged between 21 and 23, into compulsory work. Reluctant to leave for Germany, many of the draftees literally took to the hills, hiding in the maquis or bush. The growing resistance movement in the southern zone became known as the maquis, to distinguish them from the resistance proper, which was largely an urban-based phenomenon. Maquis groups were quick to develop their own distinctive structure and subculture, which influenced how they behaved, talked, and dressed. It became a rule that a band should never be larger than 60 men. Advisors to the groups, which included members of the British Special Operations Executive, gave help on training and tactics. They stressed that a maquisard should stay only where he can see without being seen. He should never live, eat, or sleep, except when surrounded by lookouts. It should never be possible to take him by surprise. A maquisard should be mobile. When a census or conscription for the STO brings new elements he has no means of knowing into his group, he should get out. When one of his members deserts, he should get out immediately. The man could be a traitor. Above all, it is not a maquisard's duty to die uselessly. To counter the sudden growth in the resistance movement, the Germans reluctantly permitted the formation of an armed Vichy paramilitary force, the Milice, under the command of Joseph Darnon. With German forces employed in an increasing variety of other duties, the Milice was Vichy's main instrument in fighting the Maquis. Both sides detested each other, and there was little room for compassion on either side as atrocity piled upon atrocity. Pro-fascist French also found other ways of serving the Reich. Jacques Doriot, too right-wing even for inclusion in the Pétain administration, established the Légion des Volontaires Françaises with Laval's backing. This force was destined to serve on the Eastern Front in the war against Bolshevism. The volunteers were often of poor quality and tended to be thrown as cannon fodder into battles against the Russians. In July 1944, the survivors were regrouped to form a special Waffen-SS division, the Charlemagne, whose remnants were among the last troops defending Hitler's Berlin bunker in May 1945. Other French showed their support for the German regime with public displays of abuse against the Reich's enemies. The Germans took to marching Allied POWs through the Parisian streets to incite the population to violence. Laval, now concerned at Germany's deteriorating war situation, and with an eye to improving his post-war chances of survival, attempted to secure the return of some of the still exiled French POWs by complying promptly with the STO requirements. By early 1943, Germany had extended her total exclusion zone along the whole of the French coastline. After Rommel's return from North Africa via Italy, Hitler appointed him to prepare in-depth defenses to counter an Allied invasion of France, wherever it might happen. It was a daunting task, but Rommel's energy and keen eye, combined with the exploitation of tens of thousands of laborers, meant that work moved ahead fast. Even so, there was not enough time. In spite of the excellent propaganda footage that the massive concrete emplacements provided, by the time the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, some of the largest anti-shipping guns were still not in place. Rommel thought that the best way of keeping the integrity of Fortress Europe was to station the majority of German forces as close to the coast as possible. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and others, backed by Hitler, disagreed. When the Allies started their assault on the 6th of June 1944, the Mobile Reserve was far to the rear. and the opportunity to force the Allies back into the sea was lost. The difficulties that the Germans faced in deploying its panzers was due to a mixture of Allied air superiority and the efforts of the resistance movements, by this time united under the title FFI, Force Française de l'Intérieur. They succeeded in causing serious disruption to the German rail network. In spite of the initial German failure, the liberation of France proceeded at an agonizingly slow pace. The advance fell behind schedule as the Allies became embroiled in the bloody, protracted business of clearing Normandy. But there could only be one outcome. As August followed July, the British broke the siege of Caen, and with the destruction of the panzer armies at Falaise, the Allies achieved the long-awaited breakout into open country. The brutality that had been the hallmark of the German occupation continued during the retreat to the borders of Germany. Over 50,000 French civilians were to die between D-Day and the final expulsion of the invader. Acts of apocalyptic barbarism were seen in villages and towns throughout the length and breadth of the country, especially where French resistance fighters attempted to liberate settlements still behind the German front line. The most notorious acts accompanied the passage of the Waffen-SS division Third Reich as it made its way from the south of France towards the Normandy beachheads in June 1944. At Toul, the SS hanged 99 men from trees and telegraph poles, and more infamously, at Oradour-sur-Glane, a company which included many Frenchmen from Alsace, killed 642 men, women and children. Oradour remains a symbol of the helplessness of France and her people, even at the hour of liberation. The people of Paris rarely took much notice of events in the provinces, as was their nature. But by early August, the reality of liberation dispelled the torpor of the population, and on the 19th of August, open warfare broke out in the city. The catalyst for revolt was the defection of the well-armed police to the patriots. Their hoisting of the tricolor atop the Préfecture de Police on the Ile de la Cité was the call to arms. The FFI seized the moment, and fighting soon broke out around the city center. People started building barricades, and by the end of the day, 50 Germans had fallen, taking 150 Parisians with them. Hitler had ordered that Paris be razed to the ground, but the commander of the German garrison, General Dietrich von Choltitz, was prepared to negotiate. Speed was vital if the Allies were to take Paris intact, however, as Choltitz could not postpone the Führer's orders indefinitely without risking his own life and that of his family. De Gaulle urged General Omar Bradley to allow General Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division to enter the city, but he was reluctant since the Americans planned to bypass Paris. De Gaulle then urged Leclerc to act on his own, and on the morning of the 25th of August 1944, a token force of a few Sherman tanks and 150 infantry slipped into the city by the Porte de Gentilly. But Paris would not be taken without a fight. Choltitz had to make a show defending the French jewel. This he did by not letting his men know of his true intentions. Heavy fighting ensued around Les Invalides and the École Militaire. Some German strongpoints held out for several days, but the result of the battle was clear by the time Leclerc, unauthorized by the Allies, accepted the German surrender on the 25th of August. Paris had been liberated by the French, for the French. The Germans held on to the remaining French territory for as long as possible, but with the fall of Paris, the center of German occupation, the Reich's cause in France was lost. After the battle came the recriminations. The day of judgment had arrived for the informers, the milice, the collaborators, both horizontal and vertical, and the black marketeers. In the early days of the purges, many were executed out of hand, the French having learnt the process so well from their former German masters. Women who had consorted with Germans were unceremoniously paraded through hostile crowds, shaved bald and imprisoned or worse. The extent of the retribution has never been accurately calculated. Upon Anthropologists for both factions put the numbers at anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 dead. Included in the number was Pierre Laval, who could never have hoped to save his skin. The venerable Marshal Pétain was given the death sentence as well for collaboration, but this was commuted to life imprisonment, and he died in prison in 1951, aged 95. The German occupation was the scene of France's biggest disgrace. As the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre put it, "The past which fills London with pride was for Paris marked with shame and despair." The Germans had put into practice the time-honored policy of divide and rule, first implemented in France by Julius Caesar 2,000 years before. They had succeeded in appealing to the basest human prejudices, setting brother against brother. They ruled through the maxim of fear in the interests of exploitation. They left, but their legacy was one of mutual recrimination and blame, a legacy which would continue long into the post-war history of France.